Okay, so let's introduce the panel now. Joining us, Labor Senator Nita Green. Nita is in Cairns. Welcome back, Nita. And Liberal MP Jenny Ware. Jenny's in Sydney. Welcome to you too, Jenny. Why don't we start
Afternoon, Greg.
Thank you. Picking up where Chris Minns has kind of taken us there. Nita, I'll go to you first. He says, the Premier, that some of these social media platforms are failing their social licence by not complying with reasonable requests to pull this very disturbing imagery down. Is he right? What more could be considered here?
Well, thanks, Greg. And I must start by acknowledging, for Jenny and other representatives from Sydney, it's been a difficult week. I actually grew up in the suburb next to Wakeley, spent most of my childhood there, and I recognise that it's been a really difficult week for those communities. And seeing these images online would be so difficult in the circumstances, and that's why you've seen the Premier make these comments today. The eSafety Commissioner has taken some action here, and from the talks that I've had or the conversations I've had with her over the estimates table over the years, I understand that this is an evolving environment and we're always up against it with social media. Our laws need to be adaptive and change, and I think that this is an opportunity for us to look at the way that social media companies are behaving and whether there are more powers or more measures that the eSafety Commissioner can utilise to be able to stop this type of misinformation or just information intent on inflaming tensions from being distributed through our community after what has been a really difficult week.
Sure. Jenny, you will, I'm sure, be comforted somewhat by Nita's remarks. This does hit geographically, relatively close to home for you. What are your thoughts on what more could be done from a federal regulatory point of view? And I'll throw in there, Jenny, the observation that we have at least one rogue platform here, don't we, which is X, not being especially responsive at all.
Thank you, Nita, first of all, for acknowledging that. We have seen some horrific events in Sydney over the last few days, and I do, again, just want to acknowledge all of those who have been impacted by these tragedies, and also the first responders and the work that they've done has been absolutely phenomenal, as always, I should say. In terms of what can be done with these social media platforms, it does appear that we need far more regulation or a much bigger stick in this environment. It is horrific that the level of misinformation that came out about potential involvement by places of faith, mosques and churches and the like. And what I'm particularly concerned about is the very graphic and violent images that were seen by many young people, vulnerable young people, and it's simply not good enough that the companies took them down after, I should say, that both state and federal government were asking for that. I don't think it was done quickly enough. There are still images up there, and I think particularly X has not responded in a manner that I think that the community is demanding that it does respond. So it's probably, Greg, a case that there does need to be a look at the federal legislation that's in place, and there probably does need to be much greater powers given to the eSafety Commissioner.
Well, it does sound like both of you are broadly kind of looking in the same direction there, and to be fair to Michelle Rowland as the Minister, I think she is too. Certainly she's flagged as much. Look, why don't we move on from what were pretty distressing developments in New South Wales, or Sydney specifically, to environmental regulation. You have special responsibilities in this area, Nita. Now, Tanya Plibersek told us in December of 22 that the EPBC Act was broken, her word, and yet here we are, only getting at best half of a package to fix that broken system because it's too complex and 1,000 pages long, she tells us. Isn't this core responsibility for a government to do what it said it would do?
Well, thanks, Greg, and I think people for a very long time before Tanya Plibersek were talking about how broken our environment laws are, particularly through the Samuel Review, and also how complex they are and how difficult it is to put in broad-scale reform to fix this area that does two things: protects the environment, but also ensures that businesses get answers that are relatively quick and are able to make decisions that benefit the economy. Balancing those two things means that we have progressed through our nature positive reforms since being in government, and we did that last year by introducing the nature repair legislation. That was through Parliament at the end of last year, including the water trigger. And now we're going to be moving along with the next stage, which is the establishment of the Environment Protection Agency. When it comes to finishing off the work of the Samuel Review, he was very ambitious in his task that he set governments, and I remember attempts from the previous government to look at this as well. It is complex, so what we'll be doing is working continually to get that right and to make sure that we are able to have environment laws that protect the environment. Right. As you say, I've got special responsibility for that, so I'm very invested in making sure that we get this right.
All right, it's not clear, is it, Jenny, where that we'll be getting that next instalment that Nita's talking about within the life of this Parliament before the next election, 12 months from now. Does that disturb you, or are you kind of comfortable with the fact that they backed off?
Well, Greg, I would start by saying a couple of things. First, Minister Plibersek in this instance seems to have united two bodies and two industry groups that are usually on very different pages on this, and that's the environmental lobby and also the business community, those stakeholders who have had the privilege of being shown some draft legislation or some draft consultation. Seem to be united that neither party is happy. Environmental framework, environmental legislation is always about giving business community certainty, but balancing this obviously against a very important task that we have of preserving our threatened species and ensuring that our biodiversity is not further eroded in our country. My concerns with this, it's not even legislation at this point. My concern has been the process that the minister has undertaken on this. This is a minister who is part of a government who, from the minute they were elected, preached about transparency in process, transparency in government. This whole framework has been anything but that. It has only been provided to very limited stakeholders. It's been done under secrecy. Stakeholders have been made to sign confidentiality agreements,
yes,
and stakeholders have therefore been unable to come out in the usual consultation process that you have with legislation. And when you are making broad changes or proposing broad changes, this should have been a process that was far more transparent. The minister has not made that transparent. And the one thing that the minister could do in looking at any changes to the legislation is to provide certainty for not only the environmental lobby and also the business community by ensuring that in any future legislation there is certainty around timeframes for assessment and processing of applications, and that needs to be there for proponents of major projects, and sometimes that will be government, and
sure,
it also needs to be there for local communities and for environmental groups.
Yeah. I've heard some of those criticisms about process made by some of your colleagues along the way too, Jenny. Look, we might round out with migration work. These are the stronger powers for deportation of non-citizens for the immigration minister. We've had not one but now two parliamentary committees raise some concerns. Then on top of that, Nita, we have had a Senate inquiry this week where most of the witnesses seem to raise concerns. Can do better. Needs reworking seems to be the consensus. Will that happen?
Well, Greg, as you know, I'm the chair of that inquiry, and so I won't be preempting the report that we will be drafting after the hearing that we had on Monday. But I will say this on the reports that you've referred to. There is a scrutiny process through Parliament, and the Human Rights Committee particularly is tasked with a very specific role, and they've undertaken that in a bipartisan way. Labor and Liberal members of that committee have agreed on the legal advice that they've been given to make some recommendations. That is a very normal thing for the Human Rights Committee to do. My committee will be looking at the legislation more broadly, and that's why we've talked to a range of stakeholders. For my part, can I just say what I think also came through really strongly in this hearing and has been part of this debate is that we have just been left as a government a complete mess from Peter Dutton and the coalition when it comes to dealing with how we build back our migration system, but particularly how we deal with people who have been assessed to have no right to be here in Australia. And we are working through that, and the changes that have been proposed in this legislation seek to make our community safer by making sure that the government has powers to deal with those people when they need to, and trying to make sure that we close these loopholes. That's what we're seeking to do, and that's why it's pretty extraordinary the way that the coalition, quite frankly, has been dealing with this legislation from day one.
All right, I will give you a really brief reply there, Jenny. We're almost out of time, but fire away.
Well, look, with all respect to Nita, I would just say this. This is yet another example of how divided the Labor Party is on immigration policy. The Minister, unfortunately, we've seen from Minister Giles some hapless performances in Parliament, inability to answer questions. The government can't keep continuing to say this is all the fault of the former government. This government has been in now for 2 years. The minister has a department. The minister has legal advisors. The minister knew from June last year that the High Court were likely to start making these decisions. We weren't in government at that stage. It was the minister. It's a matter for the minister. A responsible minister gets proper briefings from his legal team within the department, gets proper briefings from his department and frames legislation accordingly. And the fact now that we've had some Labor backbenchers come out and express some difficulties with the legislation, we've now got yet another inquiry into legislation. This all shows that the minister and the government is completely divided and has absolutely no idea how to properly govern on this, in the immigration issue, which is fundamental to Australians.
All right, we got that in, Jenny Ware, just in the nick of time. Nita Green, going to thank both of you and say farewell at that point. We'll get you back before too long.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Nita.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Greg.